Hello, my name's Gillian Moss. Good afternoon to everyone who is in the Americas. Good evening, a very late good evening to those in Europe, and good morning, a very early good morning to those in Australia and Asia. Welcome again to the 16th ALSFAL conference and to our third plenary lecture. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's plenary speaker, Dr. Helen Capel from the University of New South Wales. Helen Capel is Associate Professor in Journalism at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Her research interests centre on news photography, text-image relations in new and old media, discursive news values analysis, and visual-verbal representations of diversity. As an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow from 2016 to 2019, Helen examined the impact of ongoing disruptions on photojournalism and visual news storytelling practices in Australian news media organisations. Key publications emanating from this research include Photojournalism Disrupted, The View from Australia, published in 2019 by Routledge, Multimodal News Analysis Across Cultures, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press with Changpeng Huan and Monica Bednarek, and the edited volume Shifts Towards Image-Centric Practices in the Contemporary Media Sphere, also published in 2020 by Routledge with Hartmut Struckel and Janup Flegig. Helen is also the co-author with Monica Bednarek of the Discourse of News Values, published in 2017 by Oxford University Press, which offers a comprehensive examination of the visual and verbal construal of news values from a discursive perspective. Helen recently completed a 3-year term as president of ALSFAL, the Australian Systemic Functional Linguistics Association. She is now leading the Halliday and Hassan Archives Working Group, other members of this group being Francis Christie, David Butt, Jürgen Doran, Alison Moore, Jonathan Webster, and Jeff Williams. The group is responsible for organizing the archiving and digitization of the unpublished materials that are part of the estates of Michael Halliday and Ruqaiya Hassan. Their aim is to produce a digital archive and associated website for future generations of scholars who might be interested in researching Halliday and Hassan, and to ready the materials to be permanently archived, hopefully with the National Archives of Australia. So we'll all look forward very much to that being ready and available. Helen uses the pronouns she, her. Her topic for today's plenary is platforming politics, photojournalism, PR, and the public. After Helen's talk, there will be time for questions, which you can place on the YouTube chat in English, Spanish, or Portuguese, and we will pass them on to Helen. So Helen, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Thank you very much, Gillian, for that lovely welcome. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now. Okay, hola, bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Muchas gracias por estar escuchando esta conferencia. Es un placer para mí estar aquí con ustedes y agradezco a Mariana y Laura por llevar a cabo esta conferencia. That's the limit of my Spanish, I'm afraid, and please, I beg for your forbearance while I continue my talk in Spanish because my academic Spanish is non-existent. It is common in Australia when we present in public, to acknowledge the lands on which we live and work, and to pay our respects to the traditional custodians of those lands. And for me, this is the Gadigal and Bedigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I also acknowledge their continuing spiritual, cultural, political, and physical connection to the land. And I thank them for their stewardship of the knowledge held within these lands. These lands have never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, the work that I am presenting on today was funded by the Australian Research Council, and the context in which the work was carried out was the complete and utter collapse of employment models for photojournalism in Australia. Now, I would describe my research as interdisciplinary. And this means that my research spans both journalism studies and social semiotics. And I would also describe my research as being multi-methodological. And this means that I draw on a wide range of approaches in my work. So, for example, I used these methods to uncover the situation for photojournalism and photojournalists in Australia. And if you'd like to know more about this particular aspect of my project and my work, then you can have a look at this book, Photojournalism Disrupted, and the work that is contained within that publication. Now, I am not going to talk about this part of my project today, but rather I'm going to focus more on the qualitative analysis of social media using both social semiotics and corpus linguistic tools in that analysis. So I was very lucky that my research fellowship gave me both the space and the time to look not only at the news media, but to also look at how the public engage with key moments of political disruption in Australia. So the case study that we're going to be looking at today centres on public engagement with the Australian federal election of 2016, and in particular on the social media platform Instagram. Now, a little cultural contextualisation is necessary, I think, for this project, for you to be able to understand some of the key things that I'm going to be talking about today. And so it was an absolutely chaotic time in Australian politics in 2016. We had had several leadership spills, and that gave us 4 prime ministers in just 6 years. We had the incumbent Liberal government could not get major industrial reform bills passed through the Parliament. And so the incumbent Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, decided he would gamble, and he called an early election. And this was after only 2.5 years of being in power. The aim of this double dissolution election was to try to increase the Liberal majority in both houses, the Senate and the House of Reps. However, it was a disaster. So, and we'll see some of that later in the talk. Another aspect of contextualization that is important is to understand a little bit about the voting system in Australia. Now, in Australia, voting is compulsory, and voting takes place in schools, in town halls, in community halls, places that become known as polling stations. And because these are community locations, this is a great opportunity for the community to do some fundraising. And so they will sell cakes, they will have a barbecue, and many Australians will confess that the only reason why they go and vote is not because it's compulsory, it's because they'll be able to get what they call a democracy sausage at the polling booth when they get there, which is basically a sausage in a slice of white bread. Quite disgusting, but yes, each to their own. Now, the most important thing here is that generally your polling station is within walking distance of your home. And so you will walk often with the whole family, often with the family dog, and you will go to your polling station and vote. So the other thing that's important to note here, which is I think quite a special case for Australia, is that political parties are allowed to campaign on the day of the election. And so what this means is that you are likely to be confronted by things like this when you arrive at the polling station. And so you will see people with paraphernalia, with how to vote cards, trying to convince you to vote in a particular way. And you have to try and walk through this gauntlet of posters and paraphernalia everywhere in order to go inside and to cast your vote. Now, my focus today is on social media. And social media has been widely researched, and it has been shown to be a site for the expression of opinions on just about anything. And now my interest is in how social media is used to discuss politics. And the 2016 election was definitely a time of significant political upheaval by Australian standards. Here I'm talking very much about Australian standards. Now, as a multimodal scholar, I was particularly interested in how a visually oriented platform like Instagram was used. And this is especially because it's very, very popular in Australia, and it is significantly used by women. And so what does this political opinion look like on Instagram for Australians? Well, Australians certainly don't hold back in expressing their who they are going to vote for at election times. And in this example here, we can see that there are a number of visual cues that show how this person affiliates with the Greens political party. So we can see their gesture, the thumbs up. We can see their positive facial affect. We can see attributes like the Greens campaign T-shirt that this person is wearing. And we can also see the circumstance. So this person is standing next to posters of their preferred candidates. We also get a filter over the image, and this was made available by the Greens for use on social media during the election. And this is also verbally reinforced through the use of hashtags in the caption area. And so we get clear support for this Greens candidate. And so what I wanted to do was to examine how Instagrammers both visually and verbally aligned with or distanced themselves from a particular political party and their policies. But I was also interested in who was posting these political posts. And so authorship is another aspect of my analysis. And in the example that you can see now on the screen, this Instagrammer is a dog. We have the dog called Norman. We can see his avatar, we can see his name as the Instagrammer, and he's behaving in very much the same way as that human example we just looked at. So we have exactly the same kind of visual construction through circumstance here. So Norman is sitting next to his preferred candidate, and this is a poster of his preferred candidate. And this is again reinforced through the verbal text where he is compelling us to vote in a particular way, and here to show support for the Labour Party. So these posts were fascinating to me, so I decided to look at these particular posts in more detail. And on the day of the election, the hashtag dogs at polling stations was trending by Australian standards. And so I collected these posts as a specialist subcorpus, and this was in addition to the main data set that I was collecting at the time using the hashtag AusVotes, which is our main hashtag that we use in Australia at the time of a federal election. And so I got 92 posts in total. And so this is a very, very small corpus, and it's very easy to analyze for qualitative analysis. Well, sort of easy, not so easy when you've got a multimodal complex. And so the interesting thing here for me was that 22 of the accounts in this data set, this very small data set, were owned by dogs. And so this data set looked something like this. And so I decided for analytical purposes to divide up the analytical space into the following units. So I used the term image to cover that image space. I used the term caption to cover the general caption space, but within the caption space, we have the verbal text that Instagrammers write. We have metadata that is realized as hashtags, and we also have a space in there for comments and replies. And of course, we also get the identifying information about the Instagrammer, which is usually in the form of an avatar and their username. Now, the question here is, how do you approach a data set like this? So it's not a big data set. So I have room to experiment with a few different approaches, but it's still a complex data set because it combines both verbal and visual elements. So how do you approach this kind of data? Do you look at each mode in turn, or do you treat the text as a multimodal communicative act and you treat it as the audience would receive it? Other questions would be, do I focus on patterns across the whole data set, or do I look for patterns within a single text? Now, since working with multimodal text, which is generally how I work, can get quite complex, I've found it very useful to view my approach in terms of a topology. And so I developed this topology to help me to position my analysis at any given stage in the process. And it also makes transparent the constraints of each particular process or approach at any given stage. And so in what follows, I'm going to show you how I use this and how I position my research as we go through some examples from the analysis. So the analysis that I'm sharing with you today is what I would call an example of corpus-assisted multimodal discourse analysis. A bit of a mouthful. We shorten this to CAMDA. And the methods that I'm going to be using combine both corpus linguistic methods and tools, and also uses qualitative linguistic and visual analysis. So the first thing that I wanted to know with my little dogs at polling stations corpus, the data set, sorry, I shouldn't call it a corpus, it's only a tiny little data set. The first thing I wanted to know was whether these Instagram posts were actually focused on the semantic domain of the federal election. And so what I was doing here was looking at patterns across all of the texts. And I started by looking only at the verbal text. Okay, so that verbal section of the caption space. Now, to do this, I used the corpus linguistic software Antconc, and I use this to just create a word list of the most frequently appearing words in this data set. Now, two key observations can be made here. So first of all, lexical word forms such as election, vote, democracy, polling, all of these words are very frequent, and they establish the semantic domain of the election as the key focus of these posts. So people, yes, were talking about the election. We also have two political parties that feature in this very small data set. So that's the Labour Party and the Greens Party. And of course, we also have dogs that are frequent in this data set. And this reminds us of another key topic of this data set. It's also about dogs who were at polling stations on the day of the election. So to answer that first question, we can say, yes, these posts were totally focused on the election through their verbal construal. So then I shifted my perspective and I decided to examine each caption in more detail to see how those photo preferences were linguistically realized. And so that's by looking just at the caption text within one Instagram post at a time. And again, I'm only looking at the verbal component for this part. So here I'm focusing on engagement and attitude resources, and quite simply, Instagrammers explicitly state who they are voting for and who they are not voting for through monoglossic assertions mostly. There was almost no inscribed appraisal in the data set at all. We only had two captions that expressed emotion or desire, and that's, you can see in the bold font there. And there was only one caption that made a very harsh judgment, and that's underlined there, of the incumbent government. And this example is also an intertextual reference to a television character who also makes this same statement. And so overall, the Instagrammers are very explicit in stating who they are voting for, who they are supporting, and who they are not supporting during the election. Looking just at the hashtags, I found a similar pattern there. So again, statements, monoglossic assertions are being used, also some expletives, but only a very limited number of political parties are referred to, and all other parties are excluded. Okay, so there are more than 50 political parties contesting the election, but we only had 3 or 4 parties that were ever mentioned. So now I want to turn to the visual component of the Instagram post. And so, like with the verbal analysis, the first step here was to look generally across all of the images and to look at whether the topic of the visual component actually corresponded to that hashtag dogs at polling stations. So did it actually visually represent this? So here, what I'm looking at is I'm asking the question as to whether the hashtag works as a visual topic marker. So do we see dogs at polling stations in the visual? And so I can answer this question by doing a very straightforward representation analysis of the visual component. And so here I'm asking the question, what are the images about? So looking at who is the represented participants, what are they doing, and where are they located? And so here are some examples from the data set. And as you can see in these examples, dogs do indeed appear at polling stations, and this is a fair representation of the data set. In fact, virtually all of the almost all of the images, apart from 2, showed dogs at polling, either sitting inside or outside the polling station. Okay, so if I think of this hashtag, does it work as a visual topic marker? Then I can say, yes, it does. This particular hashtag does actually correspond to what is visually represented. Okay, so but I also wanted to have a look in more detail, again, only focusing on just the visual component. So here I wanted to shift perspective and just look, how do each image express affiliation with a particular party or candidate just through the visual. Okay, so the question here then is, what visual cues are used to align the Instagrammer with a particular party? And so again, here I'm examining things like possessive and symbolic attributes in the image participants. And again, I draw analogy to their human counterparts and how they express support for a particular party. So humans wear T-shirts, they hold the voting paraphernalia, and they also co-locate themselves by association with a particular party by standing next to posters and call flutes of their preferred candidate. And so again, I'm making an assumption that dogs can behave in a similar way to humans. And again, we get the same representations. So we have dogs wearing campaign T-shirts, wearing badges, showing their affiliation with a particular party. We have them wearing particular color of clothing that is associated with a particular party. We have them sitting next to posters of their preferred candidates. And we even have one dog that is holding voting paraphernalia. So if we look at the results of this analysis all together, this is what I found across the whole data set. So immediately here we can see that there is only a very limited number of parties that are referred to in this data set, 6 in total. And most of the parties are excluded from this data set. The left-leaning parties like the Labour Party, the Greens Party, Animal Justice Party, these are mostly affiliated with. And the right-leaning parties, so the Liberal Party and Family First, these are mostly distanced from. What we can also see in between here is a fair representation of irreverence towards the election, in that invented dog parties or sausage parties received a much larger vote of confidence than our incumbent Liberal government did by 10-4. And so just to this point, I just want to give some interim conclusions as to what I found in this stage of this analysis. So we can see that affiliation is both visually and verbally expressed, and visual and verbal resources are used to express opinion. We have that Instagrammers are very, very good at combining both visuals and verbals to express their opinions. And certain hashtags, for example, dogs at polling stations, are a good predictor of what the visual topic of an Instagram post might be. But I think more research could be done in that area, and I think it could be quite interesting to see when there is that association between a hashtag and what is visually represented. But what I also noticed in this little data set was that some Instagrammers are using their pets as a cover to express more controversial views. And so this, again, was another little fascinating avenue for me to explore. And so this is what I would like to focus on for the second half of my talk. So this last point here is points us to a very interesting question in this data set around authorship. And so when we look at a post like this, we have a dog called Ron Swanson. And this dog, Ron Swanson, is making this very negative judgment of the government, but is also referencing another Ron Swanson intertextually, who is the actor, the TV character who also expresses these words. And so who is responsible for this utterance in this text? And this is what I found very interesting. And so now what I'm doing is I'm shifting my focus now to examine the post as a multimodal communicative act, or as Kress would call it, a modal ensemble. So now I'm looking at the visual and the verbal together within the entire post. And this then becomes an incredibly rich analytical unit. Now, before I move on to the analysis, I have a request of you as my audience today. And that request is that you suspend any form of disbelief that you think whether a dog can actually really be an Instagrammer. Okay, I'd like you to, just for a moment, come with me on a little journey into thinking that dogs can be Instagrammers. So in exploring authorship, I decided to draw on Goffman's notion of footing and his differentiation of speaker roles in the production of an utterance. Now, of course, when he produced this framework, he was applying this to spoken language. But I am going to apply this to a mediatized context where visuals and verbiage co-construe the text. So just briefly to look at Goffman's framework here. So there are 3 roles that are taken up in the production of an utterance. And often these 3 roles are conflated into one speaker. And so these roles are the animator, or what he calls the talking machine. And this is the individual who is active in the role of utterance production, the one who actually speaks the words. We also have the author as another role, and this is the one who has selected the sentiments that are being expressed and also the words in which they are encoded. And then the third role is the role of principal, and this is the one whose position is established by the words that are spoken, whose beliefs have been told, and the one who is committed to what the words are saying. Now, I recontextualize these roles into a mediatized context. And so I take Instagram to be the animator, the reading machine, if you like, the interface on an electronic device through which audiences may view and read a post. Now, usually, I would say that the Instagrammer is the author. They are the ones who capture the images, they think of the words to write, and they post both the words and the images to this Instagram interface. And I also take the Instagrammer to usually be the principal. And so, as we know, social media is often seen as an expression of the self and of one's own ideas. And so you would generally assume that the Instagrammer is also principal. Now, I say usually here is because both of these roles of author and principal can be manipulated in some way. And this is what makes the use of this particular framework and this data set of the dogs at polling stations So interesting, and this is such a useful tool for examining these manipulations and the ways in which we can play around with these roles. And so I'm going to demonstrate now the ways in which I think this occurs. So again, I want to start from a congruent human example to try and bring you along with me into this little journey. So the Instagrammer here is the person who is photographed, the person who has written the post, and it is their position that is established through this post. So in this instance, I would say that the author is the principal. So if I use the same principle for a doggy example, again, the Instagrammer is photographed, the Instagrammer writes the post, and it is their position that is being established through this post. And again, I would say author is principal. But of course, what we've got to agree to here is that dogs can be Instagrammers. So in both cases then, in this human example and in this doggy example, I would say that the author and principal is the Instagrammer. But of course, we know that this is not true. This can't be true. Dogs cannot be Instagrammers. I think, I hope, I don't know if we all agree on this, but surely dogs can't really be Instagrammers in and of by themselves. So what we need to do here is we need to acknowledge that sitting behind this doggy Instagrammer, there is a human. And so I would contest that this human ventriloquizes on behalf of the dog. So it still looks like the dog is the Instagrammer, of course. That's what ventriloquism is all about, is that you hide the fact that you are speaking on behalf of someone. But by realizing that there is a human involved in this process of creating this dog post, we can start to question whether or not the beliefs and values of that human are also being channeled through the dog. And that then opens up the space in the area of the principal, the one who is invested in these ideas. And this opens up space for them to also become involved in the expression of this opinion. Okay, so let's turn to another example now. And so in this example, we have a separation of a human Instagrammer and a photographed third party, which happens to be a dog. And the human, the verbiage reports on the thoughts and feelings of this photographed third party, not the Instagrammer. So this is not the ideas of the Instagrammer being represented in these words. So here I would contend that the Instagrammer, while they are acting as author, they're acting more like an editor of someone else's words or ideas, and they're managing the representation of this third party. And so the principal in this instance would be the photographed dog, who is being talked about in the verbal text. So in this instance here, then we have the author as editor, and we have a separation then between author and principal, and the principal is, in this case, the photographed dog, or the other that is represented in the image. So what I'm suggesting is happening here is what Goffman would term as subtle shifts in footing. So when an Instagrammer posts about themselves or as themselves and about themselves, then I would suggest that we see them acting as both author and principal. When an Instagrammer is posting about someone else, I would suggest that the Instagrammer acts more like an editor, so we get a separation of author-principal. When an Instagrammer is posting for someone else, then the Instagrammer is acting as a ventriloquist. And finally, when an Instagrammer is posting in someone else's words, then the Instagrammer could be viewed as an endorser of those ideas. Now, these last two here are very interesting because in these two, I would suggest that we get some innovation, some play, and some beauty coming into the Instagram posts because we're playing around with the footing here. And so I just want to explain these last two again with some further examples. So here we have a congruent example again. So we have our doggy Instagrammer called Punky Roo, and he is both the author and principal of this post. However, the direct verbal and visual address of this dog with the audience suggests that he is looking straight through the camera to the human ventriloquist. So he is both acknowledging and addressing the human who is mediating this post with the dog. And that brings this intervention of the human into consciousness, and therefore is playing also with the audience in making the invisible become visible and making it very clear that we can actually see this human being addressed in this very direct way. To go back to our example of Norman, so here again we have a congruent, I would say a very congruent example of doggy Instagrammer, Norman, who is author principal, and he stands by he gives advice to voters through the projection in the verbiage. However, we have this additional participant in the image, albeit via a poster. And this additional participant is engaging with the audience through direct eye contact. And so here I would suggest that we have an additional principle as well as Norman. And so Norman here is sharing the stage with this extra voice, and both of them are telling us how we should vote. In this example here, we have again this separation of the human Instagrammer with the photographed third party. And in the verbiage again, we have this projected clause. And so we can question here, well, who is principal in this post? Is this the ideas of the Instagrammer or the photographed? Or is it both of them? And so here I would suggest that space is being opened up for multiple principles to be invested in these ideas. And so we have this blurring of the boundaries between who can be principal. In fact, any of them can be principal. And finally, I want to bring you back to the Ron Swanson example because it is such a lovely example. So we come back to Ron Swanson, the French bulldog, that's his name. And he gives us this very negative judgment of the government. And this negative judgment is also attributed to another Ron Swanson, who is the television character on the show Parks and Recs. Now, he has an incredibly dismal view of government. And these are words that he utters on the show. And so by quoting another source, then the dog, as author, is also endorsing the words, and therefore I would suggest that he is sharing the role of principal with the character Ron Swanson as well here. So to bring this to a conclusion, I just want to take a step back now and ask the question, well, what does an analysis of footing tell us about this particular data set? Well, what I found with this data set was that the Instagrammers posting to dogs at polling stations were very good at sharing their political opinions. So a very high percentage does so. And this is much, much higher than the other data sets that I collected, which sits only at around about 6% of posts expressing some form of political opinion. And here it's 50% of the posts. Now, to share any sort of opinion on social media is a big risk. And so why would you do this kind of thing? Well, one of the reasons that being able to play around with who is invested in these ideas and authorship in this way, it's a way of creating humor and affiliation also with your audience, because they get the joke and they play along with you and can understand what's sitting behind these posts, or who is sitting behind these posts. This can also allow us to blur the boundaries between who is invested with the opinions that are being both verbally and visually expressed in the text. But also it adds some distance, and this is very important here because it distances the human self from these ideas by channeling them through the pet. And I would contend that this is a way of keeping the trolls at bay. Now, just a curious fact, I didn't know this at the time when I was doing this research, but when I came to publish out of this research, I contacted the dogs in these Instagram posts and sorry, I've just lost my my screen. I'll just bring that back up. So a curious fact was that I contacted 9 dogs to ask their permission to use their posts in various publications. What I discovered was that all of the humans behind these dogs were women. And so one of the conclusions that or a hunch that I get out of this is that the trolls are less likely to attack a doggy Instagrammer than they are a woman Instagrammer who dares to express a political opinion. So some conclusions then. As I noted earlier, sorry, I've just got a little frog in my throat, just give me a second. So what has this analysis shown us? So one of the aims of my DECRA was to gauge public opinion on matters of political significance. And my findings for this small data set were confirmed by the larger data set that I collected in showing that in the 2016 election on social media, there was a lot of support for left-leaning parties and there was a lot of dissent directed at the right-leaning parties. The actual election result was that the Liberals lost 14 seats and the Australian Labor Party won 14 seats. Now, if you remember at the beginning of my talk, I said the aim of the election had been to try to increase the majority of the Liberal Party in Parliament. The Liberals did win the election, however, their majority was reduced down to 1 seat. And so it was a complete disaster in that respect. So what I also hope to have shown you through this analysis is that Instagrammers are adept at using both verbal and visual semiotic resources to show their opinion. And this extends to the innovative manipulation of author roles to mask their identity and to use their pets as a conduit for more controversial ideas. And this is an especially clever way of engaging in political discourse on social media, where there is a very high likelihood of being trolled if you are a woman. And finally, what I hope that this study has shown you is the value in taking a multi-methodological approach with complex data sets. So looking both at inter and intra-semiotically at your data set, as well as drawing on a range of theoretical tools. For me, the topology adds a level of transparency to my research, and it is a means of acknowledging the limitations that a single perspective will be able to bring to bear on a data set. And what I also hope is that this encourages you to consider the contributions of all modes of meaning in your own research. And I thank you very much for your attention. These are some of the references that I have used in this analysis, and I would be happy to take questions now. So thank you for your time and your attention. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Helen, for that fascinating and also very entertaining talk. I really enjoyed it and learnt, I must say, an enormous amount, because I must admit to being very ignorant about Instagram, so I learnt an enormous amount from your talk. We will be taking questions. We have some time for questions. Those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions, if you could please post them on the chat on the YouTube channel, and they will be passed along to us. And while people have time to sort themselves out and do that, perhaps I could start the ball rolling. I'm not quite sure. I have several questions for you. I might begin with the last point you mentioned about affiliation, about how it is construed both verbally and visually. At one point in your talk, you suggested that affiliation was more often visually construed, whereas disaffiliation was more often verbally construed. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, what you think some of the reasons for that might be. How did you notice it?
Sure, yeah. I think, well, certainly through animals, it's very hard to show how you disagree or disaffiliate with a particular party. In the main data set, so the ALSFAL data set, of course, I was dealing mostly there with human participants. And one of the ways is the most common way that you can show that you disagree is by using a gesture, and often the middle finger in your image to show that you don't agree with a particular policy. And we had a few posts that did that, but they were mostly men who they would have either the filter on their screen, or they'd be standing next to a poster of someone and making that rude gesture towards that poster. And so the resources, I think, for visually expressing disaffiliation, I would say, are more limited than how we can express that verbally. So I think that's one reason why disaffiliation is not really widely expressed visually. And also, you know, it's immediate, and I don't recall seeing too many women expressing those kinds of directly negative sentiments towards a particular party, again, for reasons that probably was to protect themselves. So, because obviously in the visual, it would be immediate that you can see that. But in this doggy data set, it would be difficult to show how a dog, unless, I don't know, maybe we can see them tearing up a pamphlet from a particular political party or something, or actually, I guess you could also show them, defecating or pissing up a poster or something to show that how they negatively align with this, disalign with this particular person or party. So yeah, so I for me, it's a matter that it doesn't lend itself to being visually construed, whereas obviously there are many ways in which we can, in our verbal text, show that we do not align with a particular party or their policies.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I'm interested what you just said, that the few people who do show their disalignment visually tend to be men, which relates to your point about how all the people behind the doggy Instagrammers were women. So that's another question. Does this protection from attack from trolls work only when the dog is the Instagrammer, or would it also work if there was a human Instagrammer with the photographed third party?
Yeah, I mean, that's where the blurring of the boundaries come in there, isn't it? Because you can defend yourself in a way of saying, oh, that's not my idea, it's that dog, it's that dog who's saying that, not me. And so there is that extra step that needs to be taken, both in how we process the meaning in the post, but also in how the Instagrammer can take a step back. And if they do start to get some negative comments or attract negativity in the comment area, they can take that step back and say, well, it's not my opinion, it's the dog that's saying this. And so, that to me, I think these are quite clever ways of maintaining that blurring of the boundaries, because am I invested in this? Am I not invested in this? And I think that's part of the cleverness of the play that goes on by masking this authorship in this way. And it just opens up these spaces where maybe you can defend yourself, or maybe you can protect yourself somewhat from being attacked for expressing a particular opinion. So it's just that dance and that negotiation between between everyone who is involved in both the conception and the reception of an Instagram post.
Very, very complex. And as you say, very interesting, the differences here between how safe men feel doing certain things on Instagram that women don't. We have another question here from someone in the audience who asked, have you looked at the response section or comments to see how audience interpret the roles of author and principal? Is the playfulness engaged, or is there a different response unmasking the author when there is disagreement in the negative evaluation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I didn't at the time, no, look at the comment responses. So I don't know if there was that unmasking happening in the comments. That would be very interesting, I think, to just take this a step further. Why didn't I think of that? That's a brilliant idea. Whoops. So yes. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
For the next Australian election, you can do another polling station study and look at the comment sections as well.
If I may ask a question back to you guys in South America, in Uruguay, in various countries that you're based in, do you actually have that concept of being able to campaign? Are political parties allowed to campaign on the day of the election and to show all of their posters, paraphernalia and everything at polling stations?
Well, I myself can only answer for Colombia, but in Colombia, no.
No.
In Colombia, campaigning is officially stopped. Can't remember if it's 24 hours or 48 hours before the polling stations open. So no, there's no campaigning at the polling stations. No. I have no idea if there are any doggy Instagrammers.
Yeah,
if anybody else could answer for anywhere else in Latin America. Here Mariana says that in Uruguay, you cannot campaign officially, but you can be at the polls and distribute brochures.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of halfway measure. There was also a comment here that so many of our students are interested in analyzing Instagram texts, and this is a really valuable perspective to actually do it. I was also going to mention that I really found your topology for the different ways of going into a multimodal text really interesting, and it definitely does show up that you need to look at it from different perspectives and then bring them together in order to really have a complete analysis. So I think that is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've developed with Monica Bednarek in the work that we've done together on discursiveness values analysis, and just the sheer fact that we work across the boundary of words and images, and often we separate them out, and we don't, you know what's going on in the verbal text, you know what's going on in the visual text, but then do you bring that together and actually look what are they doing together as a multimodal artifact? And so I think that was the reason for developing this topology, to actually acknowledge and recognize those limitations that each approach brings, because people tend to make conclusions about a text making claims for what it does and doesn't do when they're ignoring a huge pot of meaning making in other aspects of the text. And I think, and so for me, this was something now that I apply in every research project that I do, just to make sure that I'm ticking all the boxes and just making sure that I'm covering, and I'm not making claims beyond what is actually represented at any stage in the analysis. And it just also opens up for me when I then need to take another step into another approach to the analysis, to be able to say, well, okay, so how does it look from this perspective? It's been a really useful tool for me. So I can highly recommend it if anyone would like to use it.
Well, I have in my group, we have done something similar working with school textbooks, because we originally started analyzing only the verbal part of the text, and then we realized, well, we've got to have a look at what's going on in the images. And it's incredible how often there is virtually no relation between the meanings in the verbal text and the meanings in the visual images. They just seem to be put there as decoration. But there are some more questions coming up here. The step-by-step guide to analyze multimodal text with the topology. Can you talk more about criteria to identify the principle in this complex texts?
So basically what the topology is aiming to do in this particular configuration is to ask the questions, do we look, first of all, within mode? So do we only look, say, for example, at the verbal text, or do we only look at the visual text? And so on the horizontal axis, what we're doing is, so the criteria here are sort of either within mode or between mode. And so do you actually examine the text as it would be originally received by a reader or an audience as a multimodal complex? And so that's what the horizontal criteria are about. The vertical criteria are about whether or not you stick within one text and you look at the configurations of meaning within that text. So, for example, if you are looking at, say, a school history text, you might do a genre analysis of the staging of that text, that one text of the verbal component. So you'd be working down in the bottom right-hand corner of the topology. And so the vertical axis is about looking at one text or looking across multiple texts. And because I work with Monica occasionally on different sorts of projects, so she's a corpus linguist by trade. And so she's going to look at large numbers of texts, and whereas I'm a qualitative discourse analyst, so I just want to look at one text. And so, but we have to find the compromise between those two. So the vertical axis is where we say, okay, so we're going to look at all of the text and all of the meanings across the entire data set. And then we can come down into the individual text and look at how meaning is construed in one text. Of course, once you start looking at several texts in, like, for example, in my little data set, you know, I start with one post as a multimodal communicative act. And then, of course, if I then look at the next one and the next one, then I'm actually shunting up to the top of the topology by then expanding that view into looking at a lot more texts across the data set. I can do that with this data set because it's very small. So I can shunt. I mean, that's the idea of a topology as well, is that you can move around in different areas of the topology. You can be more intermodal, and you can be less intermodal. You can be more intrasemiotic, or you can be less. So you know, it's a matter of degree, and so positioning as a topology allows you that flexibility in your analysis at any stage.
Right. Yeah. There's another question here regarding have you analyzed symbolic images? This person says, thank you, Helen, for such an interesting analysis. I've been particularly interested in how to deal with symbolic images that I believe can be conceptual or narrative. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've done a study of this research grant was lovely because while it gave me the opportunity to focus on just photojournalism and the news media was my core project here, I could expand what I looked at and step back from this and also include how the public engage with social media on these particular key aspects of Australian society and politics and history. And so I looked at the federal election as well, and how that was reported in the news media and how it was positioned on social media, which is part of what this project is looking at today. I also looked at a major cultural event in Australia, which is Australia Day. And so there I actually did a little case study in looking at how the Australian flag was used both by the news media and by people on social media. And so I don't think we can get more of a symbolic image of nationhood and national identity than one's national flag. And so I did a little study of how that was used, but also the Aboriginal flag was part of that study, and the Torres Strait Islander flag as well. And so we had these three national flags that are officially endorsed in Australia. And I did a study there of how that appeared both on social media and in the news media. And of course, it's huge on social media because it is an instant representation of nationhood through the national flag. And so we could, so that's a very easy way of expressing your affiliation there as well with your notion of identity and of course we had a really large representation of the Indigenous flag as well, because this is a very contested day in Australia. It falls on the 26th of January, which was the day of invasion by the British back in 1788. So it is an incredibly divisive national holiday, or national day, I should say. And so I've only looked at the flag in that particular data set, and it appeared very prominently, as do foodstuffs as well. You know, sort of the National Day also brings out all the disgusting foodstuffs that we share as a nation.
Democracy sausage.
Well, yes. Well, the democracy sausage would also be that was another data set that I did collect separately, and there are many configurations and many contestations about what the democracy sausage should look like and what it should never look like, and how you should eat it and how you shouldn't eat it. And so there was a lot of debate around that in relation to the federal election as well. So, but yeah, so I mean, these were tens of thousands of posts that were being made at the time. So I had to quarantine what I could cope with in terms of analysis. And so 92 posts in a doggy data set was very, very amenable to me for this analysis.
For doing the detailed qualitative analysis. Yeah. We have another question here, going back to the question of trolling and self-defense. The question says, you seem to have identified a discourse strategy to self-protect the public image when expressing dissent. Have you found other signs that index a gendered author through the use of this strategy in connection to visual or multimodal style?
The short answer is no. I haven't. I can't pinpoint anything at the moment that does speak to the thing that surprised me about this data set was that I only found out by mistake it wasn't my intention to ever look at who was behind these doggy Instagrammers. It was only because I did the right thing and asked for copyright permission to publish their posts that I actually discovered this. And so it's not actually part of my research. It was just a happenstance of the circumstances at the time that I did discover this. And so, of course, you know, I've made something of this because I think it's very important that we acknowledge who does sit behind the posts. That could have been another aspect of the research project to find out who does sit behind these doggy Instagrammers. But I mean, the dogs of Instagram is a big field anyway, and there are huge followings of the dogs of Instagram, just as there are probably cats on Twitter. I think we have dogs on Instagram, and so I think it would be interesting to then go and have a look at authorship and other ways in which people might disguise their opinions or political views or other things, comments that they might make in other domains, whether or not there's a gendered aspect to that. But unfortunately, no, I don't know of any other ways in which this operates.
So it's interesting that it does coincide with what you were saying about visual disaffiliation, which is mainly done by male Instagrammers.
Well, that was definitely a trend in the larger data set, that there were that they were men, or you know, from looking at the avatars and the usernames and of course, you know, I can't definitively say who these people were, but you know, the photographed dissent was by and large male, and it was using offensive gestures towards, and that was about the limit of their being able to visually express that dissent.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's a question here about media. Have you looked at the circulation of these meanings produced on social media? Do they move up to the news media? Are these talking pets' opinions picked up by the news media? Have these masked authors been able to influence public discourse, maybe bringing a focus on new topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was the correlation between the two data sets that I was trying to uncover in this major project. I mean, the long and the short of it was that professional photographers had been sacked by almost all the newspapers in Australia. And so my question was, well, where are they getting their news images from? And a lot of scholars will tell us that these images are now provided by citizens. And I wasn't sure that that was the case. And so in this study, I was trying to look at, do the social media ideas and representations get taken up by the news media and get transferred from them into the news media? The short answer there again is no, it didn't. However, the dogs at polling stations concept was picked up as a news story on this particular election, the day after the election. And it was picked up as, sort of just one of the things that people are doing, along with going to get your democracy sausage. You had your dogs at polling stations, and they included a couple of posts in a news story about them. What I was interested in my study was to see whether or not this actually influenced how and where and what was talked about in the news media. As I said in this study, and also in the larger study of the social media, there was great support for Labor and the Greens Party on social media. Everyone was throwing themselves behind these political parties, and there was a lot of dissent directed at the Liberal Party. That's our conservative party in Australia. And they were very unhappy with Malcolm Turnbull, very unhappy with the Liberals in general. And so in the news media, the conversation was very much about Labor and Liberal, and the Greens were out of it. And so there was actually something quite different happening on social media, in that the Greens were part of that conversation. In the news media, the Greens were very, very backgrounded. And they didn't feature so much. But also in terms of the photography on social media being used by the news media, that also didn't happen. And so the sad fact of my research, unfortunately, is that while the photographers have lost their jobs, they're still doing the job. Now they're doing it as freelancers, as sole traders, as small businesses, and they've lost all of their benefits, all of that security of being in a staff position. They're now part of the precarity of the casually employed, and it's heartbreaking for Australia. They're still doing the work, but they're just not getting paid in the same way as they used to. And this is the conundrum for me, coming from this background myself, is to ask the question, why is it the photographers that lost their jobs? Can the photographers not also be writers and, rounded journalists? Why is it that the journalists are being tasked with capturing images as well, or relying on this freelance community? And this speaks to me to the very desperate position of the photograph in the world of the news media, in that it has never been fully valued and fully recognised.
So the conclusion from that would be that newspaper editors really need to have a look at your topology
Yes.
to understand the importance of the different parts of the news stories. Yeah.
They need to look at my PhD as well, which is where I actually really argued that you can actually champion press photography, and it can be beautiful, and it can really make a difference in how we engage with the news media. So,
going back to what you were saying just now about Labour and the Greens and the Liberals, one of the comments I was going to make, that it seems that the doggy Instagrammers are all left-leaning because they all seem to want to vote Labour or Green. But you've explained that now, that basically in the social media, the majority of the support was for Labour and the Greens and not for Liberals. So obviously the doggies are all going to be voting for Labour or for the Greens.
Yeah. I mean, it could also be a reflection of the owners as well, and sort of where their interests lie. You know, they might be interested in animal rights or in, sort of environmental issues. I don't know if I'm stereotyping here about dog owners, but I will stop there because I don't want to make any claims for dog owners at all. And I don't want to alienate any cat owners in the audience. So.
Well, I'm a cat owner, but I haven't felt alienated, so don't worry about that.
Thank you.
I thought we were coming, but there's a comment here. There was an incident in recent election in Argentina where a capybara was the character and was making demands in ecological terms. So there you are. You see, it's not just doggy Instagrammers, but there can be other animals Instagramming as well. Yeah, the possibilities are endless.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And they used humour. Yeah. Well, I think we can perhaps wind up there. Thank you very much indeed again, Helen. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you and talking to you. And thank you for all the information and all the entertainment that you've provided us with this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, and thank you all. And thanks again for the invitation. And I wish you a happy last day of the conference tomorrow, and I hope you're all going off for a lovely dinner and drinks now, and my working day will just start. So thanks again for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and have a good conference. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Bye-bye.